Good morning. It's good to be here this day with you. Our lesson today is injustice will be punished. And it's the story of Esther. And it's one of several in the Old Testament to portray the success of the Israelites living in a foreign surroundings. Sometimes these Israelites rose to influential positions. It says these accounts illustrate God's care for his covenant people. They illustrate his resolve to use them as agents to influence even when they opposed opposition, criticism, and ill treatment. The events in the book of Esther take place in the Persian citadel Susa during the reign of Xerxes I, also known as Ahasuerus. The key figures in today's lesson is Mordecai and Esther. They were part of a Jewish community that had remained in the area after they had been given a decree that they could go back to their home country. But they stayed there. And the previous queen got divorced from the king Xerxes, so Esther became queen. And the way Esther became queen was the king held a beauty contest, and Esther won. And so throughout all of this process, Mordecai and Esther are cousins, and he forbid her to reveal her nationality. And she didn't. And there wasn't any indication that the king would hold that against her, being she was Jewish, but a little later in the story it may have happened. And Mordecai may have just been aware of the prejudice against the Jewish people at that time. So eventually the scheme to destroy the Jews materialized. And Xerxes, his highest official, Haman, had developed a fierce animosity toward Mordecai. So this resulted in Haman seeking an edict from Xerxes for the annihilation of all Jews throughout the Persian Empire. And Haman secured this without revealing to Xerxes which people he had targeted for destruction. And so a date for their eradication came about, and the Jews found themselves in a dire situation. And so Mordecai convinced Esther to act at the risk of her own life to save her people. And so a key part of his appeal was to consider the possibility of divine providence was at work. This possibility can be seen in his question when he asked her, "Who knows but that you are come to your royal position for such a time as this?" So she may have become queen to save the Jews. And so her reply to that was, "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So she's willing to go to the king and make a request, even though she knows she might perish after doing this. So after 3 days of fasting, Esther went before Xerxes and received his mercy. She asked that he and Haman join her in a banquet where she would answer the king. And when prompted at the meal to offer her petition, she requested that only that they come back for another meal. So that's just kind of the context of our lesson today. And our scripture comes from the 7th chapter of Esther, beginning with the first verse. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition. And that the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to the queen, "Who is he, and where is he who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went to the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs in attendance, said to the king, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king says, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Different story here. So the king and Haman went to see the queen, or he went to the banquet for the queen, and she was this invitation to the king and Haman results from Mordecai telling her about Haman's plan to slaughter the Jews. And so the banquet that we're talking about was the second one. And the king said unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, oh, they were doing a lot of wine drinking, or the king was, and it seems to have contributed mightily to Vashti's dismissal as queen. The king had summoned the first queen, Vashti, to come to his parlor, and she refused, so he divorced her. So it says at Esther's banquet, it seems like the king was much better behaved, but he did a lot of wine drinking. It says, as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom it will be granted." Okay, he's asking her what her petition is, and he's offered to give to her half of his his kingdom. Well, you're pretty sure the king's not going to give up half of his kingdom. Then the Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. That is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." So for the people, they already planned to have them annihilated. So their time's running out, and because it's been a while since this took place. And said Esther had been queen for several years when all of this came to point. So she was kind of used to the king. She kind of knew when to push his buttons and when not to. But anyway, she said, "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." So Esther begins to expose the plot that Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. Haman must be the one to connect the dots first. He's the one that sets it up. But he realizes Esther is a Jew. They did not know that until then. Her statement where she said, "My people have been sold," and so is praised in a voice that didn't really implicate the king, but the heaping up of phrases like "to be destroyed," "to kill," and "annihilated" emphasizes the desired consequences of her people to be sold. And so she said, if we had just been merely sold as male and female slaves, she would have kept quiet. But because no distress would justify disturbing the king. So that's kind of hard to interpret, because she said if they were only sold to, if they had just been merely sold into slavery, they could have been rescued. But if they had been sentenced to die, then God, they could not be brought back from that. And Esther conveys that she seriously weighed the situation before speaking up. She may not realize that Haman has withheld the identity of the people he has targeted for destruction, which group of people. So King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. So some people wonder why the king could be so clueless. But anyway, apparently he didn't know. So the king is just now being made aware that Esther is part of the target group. And so in any case, this king is still trying to put together the big picture. And so Esther said, he asked, who is it? She said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. If Esther has been concerned that Xerxes would become defensive, here she is probably relieved to be able to point the finger squarely on Haman, who was his sidekick. But she does not identify him as her personal enemy, but as an adversary and enemy. So then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Okay, Haman's reaction is like that. And a lot of people, when they're caught doing wrong, it's kind of like the deer in the headlights, you know. So interpreters often identify this moment as the climax of the story. But Haman knows he's exposed. The only question is how the king will react, because Haman is one under him there. But the king got up in rage when he found out. He left his wine, which was unusual, and went out into the palace garden. Said, with his blood boiling, the king storms out. He need hear no self-defense from Haman. The king had just put the pieces together, and Haman's guilt is obvious. The king's highest official has abused royal authority, and though the king does not know why, Haman has had his own best in mind there. But Haman, verse 7, but Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. I mean, he's already done the damage, but he's begging for his life. And just as the king was coming back into the palace for the garden banquet, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. And in these banquets where they reclined on, they call them beds or couches, instead of sitting around a table. So he comes in and he's begging for mercy, and he kind of throws himself there begging for mercy, really. So the king comes in and sees all this, and he says, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face, because how the king might have handled Haman's treachery before seeing the man on the queen's couch doesn't matter anymore. Xerxes indicts Haman for violating harem protocol, and even worse, for appearing to molest the queen, which he really didn't, but that's what it looked like, and it's what the king thought. And so they covered Haman's face because he is no longer qualified or worthy to see the king. And so then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending to the king, said, a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. So he had, Haman had set up to murder Mordecai, and it didn't work out that way. So this eunuch speaks up to inform the king that Haman had erected this to execute Mordecai. So, but after the confrontation with Mordecai on the way out, he once again became enraged, and at the suggestions of his wife, and he had gallows set up. And this is all Haman's doings back when he was setting up to have Mordecai murdered. And so the king says, impale him on it. So if the king had any remaining motions of sparing Haman's life, those thoughts now leave him permanently. Mordecai had saved the king's life previously, so now the king returns the favor to save Mordecai's life. And so it says, they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. So for Haman to meet his end in the manner that he had set up for Mordecai to do is the supreme irony of the book. It's the prime example of poetic justice. Such an outcome points to God's work on behalf of his covenant people. See, a lot of this was taking place and they didn't realize that God was actually working on their side. God brings Haman's wickedness down on his own head, the way sometimes the Bible often declares. But before the day's end, Xerxes will give to Mordecai the signet ring that he had entrusted to Haman, and along with the position and authority that Haman had held. The Jews find deliverance by the second degree of the king. So this is all just kind of turned around. One bad guy, his plans got spoiled, and the Jews ended up in a better place. It says the book, though the book famously does not mention God by name anywhere, you don't see God's name mentioned. Its many twists and turns strongly hint at God's providential hand in his covenant people. We know he was with them, but in Esther's book, it didn't mention him. So from Esther's selection as queen, to Haman's execution, to the Jews' deliverance, the eyes of faith clearly see these events as much more than just luck or happenstance. Rather, God was at work behind the scenes.